What is going on, guys? Today I wanted to talk about CARB and how California controls basically all of the vehicles that are sold in the United States. Now, everybody already knows the EPA has a stranglehold on the car industry. You know, they have a very strict guidelines on what a car can do, on all this stuff. They have a very broad kind of ruling that they make. But California has their own policies that are dictated by the California Air Resource Board. It is 16 people. They get to vote on what the emissions in California are. And that's fine. You know, every state gets to pick their own things, whether I disagree or agree. I don't live in that state. I don't get to dictate what that state does. But the problem comes when you realize how much natural influence the car industry in California has. So California alone is 12% of all new cars purchased. 12%. Then when you look at states like New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey, they follow pretty much to a T the CARB standards. So altogether, there's almost 30% of the car market in the US follows, you know, you can't register a car unless it's CARB certified. So these car companies can't really make cars. They can make cars that don't fit those markets. But the problem is that if they make a specific car that doesn't fit the CARB rules, all of a sudden they can't sell in California. So the problem becomes pretty apparent when you realize that these car companies can't afford to make specific models or specific trim levels or specific engines that are not CARB legal, because they would be making too many things. It would start to become a nightmare for the car manufacturers. And then when you start thinking about the higher end cars, the luxury cars, the higher emission muscle cars, a lot of those need to be sold in those markets. So they can't afford to exclude those markets from their vehicles. And that, unfortunately, is how a board of 16 people get to dictate the entire car market. So think about this. There are 16 board members. 2 of them are professors in environmental science. 1 of them has a PhD in astrophysics. 1 of them has a degree in art. 1 of them has a law degree. 1 of them has a master's in public policy. 1 of them has a master's in social work. They get to decide how a car is, in essence, made, because you can put any obscure rule you want, and then that state of California and New York and other states have to follow said law, whether the car brand can do it or not. And we've seen some car brands that just can't do it. They just can't make it happen. So they end up falling back and, you know, struggling and not making the cars that the consumers seem to want. You know, you sometimes think, you're like, man, you know, I'd really love a car that this, and this. They can't make them for these reasons. So you end up with this weird rule where, yes, the EPA laws are not as strict as CARB laws, but CARB laws end up being the rule of the land. And that is a natural situation, not a natural, it's an unnatural situation that, you know, they get to dictate. But, you know, it works similar where, you know, China is the largest car market in the world. So a lot of cars kind of have to play to them, and it's the same situation. You have to play to your biggest market and hope that the smaller markets just kind of follow suit and figure it out. And more about the CARB research deal, the resource board. They have 1,300 employees, $581 million a year budget. They are appointed by either the California Senate or they are appointed by the governor. So Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, appointed 6 of the members himself, and they were subsequently approved by the board by the Senate, and then they were put on the board, and they've been there for, quite some time. Some of them, some of them are going to be there for like the next 9 years. Some of them will be there for a couple of years. It's kind of mixed on how that works. But what are some of the rules? So California has some crazy rules that obviously these won't fit with the rest of the country. Some of this stuff doesn't actually, not all of it crosses over because it just can't. I mean, they have rules about car companies have to sell 35% of their passenger car sales must be zero emission vehicles. So not even plug-in hybrid. They have to be actually zero emission. Obviously, that doesn't cross over to everything. I don't know how that crosses over to places like New York, but that is the California law. So things like that won't impact us directly, as some of like the Clean Air Advanced Clean Truck Act, the ACT rule, that kind of stuff implements us very directly. And, with their the amount of emissions that they allow, and then the amount of emissions that they allow out of the tailpipe of, say, your standard passenger car. So, if you want a new Chevy Impala, it is likely CARB legal, which means that they dictate the amount of emissions that can come out of the tailpipe. So by 2026, 119 grams of CO2 per mile is what they allow. So that ruling goes across across the board, and then all vehicles, if they want to be able to sell in the largest U.S. market by percentage, they will have to follow these rules. So I don't know if we will see a lot more car companies taking the risk of developing cars that are not CARB legal and just saying, too bad, you cannot register it in the Northeast and also like the Western coast, because even some of those states also follow it. Oregon, Washington, Colorado, some of those West Coast states follow the same. Colorado is not fully on board. They partially adopt part of their program, but then, the Northeast is heavily on board with, New York, New Jersey, Mass, Connecticut, Vermont, Maryland, Rhode Island. They're pretty heavily all in. When you incorporate all of those, it's pretty much the same as California size of percentage wise. So 25% of the entire market is in this situation. And even, some states adopt some of it. Minnesota, Hawaii, they they pick and choose what they want. I would imagine a lot of it is the zero emission stuff, because it's very difficult to require zero emissions. You can easier to require low emissions than it is to require zero emissions. So once you start getting into that actually zero, it starts to become really, really tricky, because now we end up in this situation where you have to have an electric vehicle. You're not talking just a plug-in hybrid, talking full electric or hydrogen, which kind of still a pipe dream at the moment. But you end up with this very difficult situation where now you're telling people that they can't have a car that they just put gas in. You end up in this situation like California, where they have a problem with the gas tax. They're not collecting enough money in taxes at the pump to support the road system that they have. So they are now planning to tax electric vehicles per mile, something that they promoted in the beginning that you were getting to avoid by getting an electric vehicle. Now they're actually planning to implement that again in some way, shape, or form. So you end up with these kind of side situations. You end up, obviously, everybody talks about power grid. You end up there. So, places like Minnesota, where it gets a little chillier than, Southern California, are in a different situation when it comes to plug-in vehicles and chargeable vehicles. And the battery situations is a problem in itself. the U.S. is funding heavily into electric vehicle technology, and it is just not sparking the way that probably not a pun there. Didn't mean to say that, but it's just not taking off the way that they really imagined. So they're actually funneling so much money into it right now to create this incentive program and to create new factories and to help fund the quote unquote big three, the old big three, I guess you could say, Ford, Chrysler, Stellantis, and Chevy, into a new zero emissions situation. And then they are basically putting the tax burden back onto the people. So instead of the free market dictating what cars you want to buy, they are now using the boot, if you will, to tell you which cars you should buy. And it's across the board. So California says by 2026, 35% of new passenger car sales must be zero emissions. That is an increase of 68%. This increases to 68% by 2030 and then 100% by 2035. So by 2035, the vision going forward is that California and other states will not allow any new vehicles to be sold that are not zero emissions. And that doesn't just go for road going vehicles, that goes for small equipment as well. We've already seen them pushing for lawn equipment being zero emissions and generators and things like that. I know a generator being zero emissions sounds crazy, but that is the things that are being pushed. So other states will obviously start adopting this, and states do have this right to implement these laws. Obviously, they can be fought in district courts and taken to the top, and you can fight per regulation and per law, but they will be able to implement them, and then you will have to fight for your rights back. So that's kind of how this is, that's how I see this going. Obviously, hydrogen technology I have here, it's not, I always hear about it, but I never actually hear anything like it's close or like, we're going to get it anytime soon. It's one of those things that people just kind of yap about. I mean, I'm not against hydrogen. I just don't see it. I don't see people, I don't see that anytime soon. Some of the other things that they're planning are the heavy duty regulations. They are adding a NOx regulation for emissions on heavy duty vehicles. Anything 2024 and newer heavy duty trucks must meet their new stringent NO emissions policies. It's up 90% compared to previous standards, and it's just it's going to be rough. It's going to be really hard for a lot of people to meet a lot of this stuff. And now, like I said, this isn't just California. This is going to impact the entire car market, and that's how this regulation falls down, because they have so much power over the industry, so much power over the buying habits, and it just trickles down. So there's even a clean miles standard. Ride-hailing services must have their fleet at least 30% be zero emissions, so 30% of vehicles in a fleet of ride-sharing. I don't know if that means Uber exactly has to do 30%, but it just, again, I don't know how you regulate this, how you enforce that. They only have 1,300 employees. I don't know how you can calculate all this, but you see brands like Tesla and Rivian and Rimac are, investing heavily in these automated taxi ride-hailing services, ride-sharing services, where basically they're saying anybody can just buy a Tesla and then you can just click a switch and suddenly it'll be a taxi. Again, that sounds like a crazy pipe dream that your car is just going to suddenly just start working for you and making you money and paying for itself. It all sounds crazy, but that's part of it is those vehicles are going to have to be electric. The LEV, low emissions vehicle standards, are obviously on the rise. They are limiting. Yeah, they're adding stricter limitations to the hydrocarbons and particulate matter, which means like larger, larger particles, like dust and like actual debris, because a large problem that they're running into is tire rubber now, and I believe that's going to be their next thing to start to reel back. Softer tires, heavier cars, things like that. More horsepower, more grippy tire, more soft compound race tire will create more dust into the air. That's going to be a larger pollutant in the future than the actual emissions coming out of the exhaust pipe. So that's going to be the next thing that they have to start cracking. They don't have to, but that is going to be the next thing that they start cracking down on and start pushing for, and they will start getting after the tire companies. I've heard firsthand from tire manufacturers that they have already outlawed some of the ingredients, you could say, that they use, some of the chemicals, some of the processes for some of these big tire companies. I've had some on the podcast and talked to them, and they've told me confidentially after that there's some big stuff coming down the pipeline on tire technology and what they can do. So these things are just kind of stacking up, and eventually it's just going to be so high stacked that, either car brands start to fail, people start to stop selling in California and New York. I don't see how that's really possible. That's a really difficult thing to pull off, but it's kind of the theme of this, is the conglomerate of bluer states kind of control what's going on. A few unelected board members kind of have jurisdiction over the entire car market. It makes it a very confusing situation as well, because Chevy can't just design a car and sell it to you. They have to read this, design a car. Hopefully they've hit the target. They have to know what year it's coming out. So if it's coming out in 2026 is different than if it's coming out in 2025, if it's coming out in 2028. They've already planned this out. They can't afford to miss the mark. So you will also see a dwindling in numbers of cars that these car companies produce. And I've talked about that before, where instead of Chevy having 50 cars that they offer, they're going to have 8 cars, and then GMC is going to have their own, and then they're just going to do it that way. They're going to have Cadillac have the same cars, but they're going to dwindle down their models because it's getting too difficult and too complex and too expensive is really what it comes down to. They're capitalists. They go towards that word. What's least expensive? Least expensive is to dwindle down the car market, sell less packages, less models, less engine trims, and just kind of start, funneling down into a few select items that they can sell. And that's all going to come down to CARB. And yes, there's been huge strides in EPA regulations and, fighting these big regulatory overlords. But the problem is that these states that have all of this market share are always going to make the kind of final say, if you will. It's really going to be a sight to behold in the next 5-10 years. I know a lot of the comments are going to say, well, what happens in November, vote. I don't know how you can fight a state. They have a lot of their own powers. They have a lot of their own power. The only way that you can really kind of do this is in the state, I would say, unless, some executive orders or something like that. But these states aren't going to change based on those factors. So yes, the federal EPA regulations, which are very different than CARB, will potentially change, but a lot of this stuff comes down to a bigger overarching theme of it. So some of the history of CARB: in 1970, the Federal Clean Air Act, Congress passed it, and it was the kind of general framework of how this stuff was going to work. In 1975, the first vehicle emission standards, CARB, adopted. Those were adopted in 1975. In 1988, CARB established the LEV program, the Low Emissions Vehicle, which introduced stricter emission standards on cars and trucks. So in 88 is when things kind of started to haze in, like, they started to see them a little bit. Then in 1990, the Clean Car Program's Advanced Clean Car Program was launched, and that was part of the zero emission stuff. So electric vehicles kind of started to show themselves a little bit in the 90s, and things like the Prius obviously have been taking off. Very, very fuel efficient standards, and we all know the rise of the Prius started in Southern California. South Park very well covered that. And then in 2000, CARB really started to get a stranglehold on the greenhouse gas stuff and started to really hammer down on this stuff. And they started the initiatives to really start getting it cleaned up. And I understand California has a smog problem. I get it. I don't know how you deal with that aside from extreme regulation. Obviously, there's ways, there's routes that can be done. The route that California took was extreme regulation, and which has led to higher poverty rates and all kinds of good things like that. But that's all side conspiracy tinfoil hat stuff. But this is kind of the gist of CARB. I've had conversations with people, and they don't seem to fully grasp what is going on with CARB and why cars are like this, even if they don't live in the state. And I've wanted to kind of break this down, my thoughts. There's obviously a lot more nuance, a lot more depth to all of this, and the laws are a lot more, deeply written, where there are pages and pages and pages of of legal jargon, and it would take nobody's read them, I'm sure, besides maybe the car manufacturers. I'm sure the people that write them haven't, the people that vote on them probably haven't read them, but it is mostly just stranglehold on the emissions that come out of the tailpipe. And it's only going to get more and more strict because those 16 people have a job to do, and their job is to approve more regulation. So it'll always get more strict, but hopefully things turn around. Hopefully maybe there's a breakthrough in technology and this CARB stuff doesn't really matter. But for the time being, I think we have a lot more CARB to talk about in this in the future going forward. So I'll probably make more videos as things change, but that's basically the general gist of CARB and what things are doing. So that's going to do it, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Keep it saucy. Maybe subscribe. Leave a comment. Talk to me. Tell me what's going on. Tell me if you know something that I don't, because I am always eager to learn something from somebody that knows more than me, or is in the field, or is in the industry in a different level than me. I'm always eager to hear more. So send me an email, comment, whatever you want to do. Tell me I suck. Tell me I'm an idiot. I get that all the time also. But thank you guys so much for watching. Keep it saucy. I'll see you next time.